Mzansi, you're listening to Farmers Inside Track, proudly brought to you by Food for Mzansi. Officially, this is the world's best podcast for 2024, as awarded by One IFRA, the global organization for the world's press. And of course, I'm your host, Duncan Masiwa. Now, in this episode, powered by CropLife South Africa, we delve into critical compliance issues under the National Environmental Management Waste Act. Now, this is important legislation that classifies pesticide containers and obsolete pesticides as hazardous waste, requiring stringent disposal protocols. We're joined by Dr. Gerard Verdoren, Operations and Stewardship Manager at CropLife South Africa, alongside Compliance Specialist Quaid Singh Jam and Stewardship Specialist Hiresh Ramanand. They explain why these materials must not be burned or buried, emphasizing the significance of recycling or incinerating them through licensed companies. Dr. Gerard, Quaid, Hiresh, welcome to Farmers Inside Track.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you, Duncan. Great to be part of it.
Fantastic. It's quite a complex topic that we are talking about today, and hopefully throughout the conversation you'll be explaining it to us in layman's terms as best as possible. But maybe, Dr. Gerard, starting with you, what does the National Environmental Management Waste Act of Environmental Affairs stipulate about pesticide packaging and obsolete pesticides such as old, redundant, unused, or even leftover pesticides?
It's actually quite simple if you talk about layman's terms, because the purpose of the Waste Management Act is threefold. It's to reduce, to reuse, and to recycle. And when you talk about pesticides, obviously we talk about dangerous goods, which are also classified as toxic in most cases. And the last thing we want those things to happen with is to end up on a landfill, because our landfills are full of waste pickers that pick up valuable waste and recycle it, and they make money out of it. So the Department of Environmental Affairs built in special regulations around any farm waste. And in that section on the farm waste, they also talk about any packaging which comes off pesticide and any pesticide that become redundant. In other words, we just talk about obsolete pesticides. So these are pesticides that people don't want, or they can't use because of the ban, or they became old, or they're just standing around the farm and they serve no purpose at the farm anymore. And when you just think about the concept, these things are of nature toxic, of nature hazardous, and we don't want them to go to landfill. But we also don't want them to go into the environment. So the Department of Environmental Affairs is quite clear that you are not allowed to burn any container on a farm. You're not allowed to bury any container on the farm, because it causes environmental pollution when you burn it. It causes air pollution. It's also a risk to people and to animals and the environment with all the toxic smoke coming off. And when you bury a container, that container can stay there literally for thousands of years. And the same goes with pesticides. If you bury pesticides, it can contaminate your soil, your groundwater, the surface water, everything like this. So what they say to us is that you must dispose of any farm waste which is classified as hazardous in a responsible manner. A responsible manner means you must work through a hazardous waste management company, especially with obsolete pesticides, that they can take it and dispose of it responsibly, mainly by incineration in South Africa. So they're not allowed to take it to a landfill site anymore. With the pesticide containers, there is a duality in terms of that definition. So if the pesticide container is not properly cleaned, in other words, contaminated with pesticides, the Act regards that as something which is a hazardous object, and therefore it must go the same route as obsolete pesticides. Otherwise, it must go to a hazardous waste management company that's licensed to handle hazardous waste, and it must be incinerated. But the lucky thing for us is, in terms of South African National Standard number 10406, if you triple rinse or you spray rinse an empty container or an empty bag with pesticides for at least 30 seconds, and you do it 3 times in a row, that packaging becomes nominally empty. In other words, it doesn't contain any significant quantity of pesticide, and that becomes normal farm waste. And then the Act says normal farm waste can go into the recycling network. In other words, any pesticide container which is properly cleaned can go into the network of recycling, whether it's a HDPE drum, an LDPE bag, a paper bag, a polypropylene bag, aluminium canister. So the Act does give us a tool to take containers and clean them properly and put them back into recycling to become part of the circular economy, Whereas if it's obsolete pesticide or soil packaging, they can only go one way, and that is incineration.
There's definitely a lot that needs to be taken into consideration when handling pesticide containers and chemicals. You've touched now briefly on pesticide container handling. Quaid, bringing you into the conversation, may pesticide containers and obsolete pesticides be burned or buried on farms as in the old days? Is that still something that's happening these days?
Duncan, unfortunately, yeah. It is still currently happening, and these are in various parts of the country. We can't pinpoint it to a specific region because it is still happening all over, and there are still numerous complaints coming in to CropLife, especially to the Stewardship Forum, which is as the three of us sitting here today, where there are active communities and public complaining about these undesired behaviors that are still taking place. So it is something that there needs to be enforced and policed on properly, and that is why the Act is here. But to answer the question, it is no, not at all. It is definitely not allowed. Even though your containers are triple rinsed and stuff, you cannot bury them. I mean, the micro word that we've got these days is the microplastics. And I mean, if you look at any magazine or any article these days, as researchers are finding them in every part of the human body, or even in plants, vegetables, in water. So if you do bury these plastics, they do break down. They take some time to break down. And then you get this contamination of these microplastic, of burying these plastic containers in the soil. The smoke, you can see rubber burning plastic, that black smoke that comes up. It's a toxic fume. So that stays into the air. It fills, somebody can breathe it in. Then you've got issues again with health issues with lung contamination. And then the gradual breakdown into the soil is the most important part of it. So with all of these irregular behaviors or activities taking place, they do end up in water streams. They do end up in the oceans at the end of the day. It is definitely a threat to the environment. And burying old pesticides is a no-no. If you've got tons of liquid stored somewhere or underground buried, and these vessels or containers rupture, you have the spillage or flooding of this concentrate that goes into a water stream, and the stream feeds a village or it feeds a water source that supplies a village, for example. Imagine that catastrophic disaster that's going to be taking place there. So these incidents are unlawful, and they are very damaging to the environment, including human health. And just another point that I'd like to bring up here as well while I've got the floor on this topic. It goes beyond just the pollution that is created and the damage to the environment, but there are also consequences then for the perpetrators in this regard. So you'll have a transgressor, and if, say, somebody has been found and it has now been convicted, over and above the penalties for a convicted person for offence of this act, the minimum fine is 5 million rand or 5 years imprisonment. But just remember now, it could either be that or it could be both, the fine and imprisonment. However, what is not included there is the rehabilitation costs, which needs to be assessed over a predetermined time period to have the source or this impact on nature, to have that rehabilitated. Those costs are still added onto that person, and they will be held liable for that too. So it is an ongoing process which could be over more extent than 5 years. So those are the cost implications that everybody needs to be aware of as well.
It sounds to me that there's definitely a lot at stake when we talk about pesticide containers and obsolete pesticides when it comes to burning or burying it on farms. So Hiresh, if I can't burn it and I can't bury it, does that mean I also can't dump it at landfill sites?
Absolutely not, Duncan. It's a big no. And as you will know, this is something I have been communicating during the Food for Mzansi events that I have attended. To reiterate what Serhat said earlier, the principles of the NEM Waste Act are to reduce, reuse, and recycle in order to achieve the objectives of a circular economy. So empty pesticide containers must therefore be recycled, or at worst, be used for energy generation through incineration, for example. It makes no sense to us to dump empty pesticide containers at landfill sites where they will remain for a very long period of time, or worse, where such containers may be collected by waste pickers and used for drinking water. And as you will know, As my colleagues have explained, that may cause serious poisoning or even the death of people if they are unfortunate enough to use empty pesticide containers that have not been adequately triple rinsed, according to CropLife SA's triple rinse procedure for drinking water. Another reason to not dump empty containers at landfill sites is because it is a waste of a valuable resource which are collected by CropLife SA certified recyclers who operate recycling businesses and contribute to job creation and economic growth in the country. So since 2017, overall, it has been illegal to dump hazardous waste in landfill sites for the simple reason that it causes environmental pollution, as Wade has alluded to in his answer just now.
Dr. Gerard, I've heard horrible stories of empty containers end up being used in farm worker households where they store fishing oil, for example, in these containers. And of course, that's a big no-no for various reasons. And perhaps you'll also touch on that in this next question. But what can farmers do then with these empty pesticide containers?
The starting point for us from the CropLife perspective is that we advocate to all farmers, doesn't matter where they come from in the country, is to always make sure that that container or that packaging, when it's flexible packaging, like a bag, is properly cleaned. And we have the triple rinse procedure posters and the guidelines on the CropLife SA website under container management, if anybody wants to go and look there. But it's very simple that you triple rinse the container, and that removes basically 99.99% of all the chemicals, and the decanting water goes back then into your spray tank. In other words, what you pay for is what you use and apply to your crops. That is the first principle. The second principle people to do is to puncture the container so that anybody who picks the container up or gets hold of a container cannot use the container then for their cooking oil or for their locally made brew or for their drinking water. So you mitigate that particular problem before the problem even arises. And then the farmers must go back again to the CropLife SA website and look under container management, where we have a list of all our certified recyclers around the country, which currently stands at over 165 certified recycler containers. There are literally over 1,000 people involved in this operation with the collection and the proper recycling of the empty containers. So around the country, we have the provinces pretty well covered. We are still developing new collection points for farmers. From the Eastern Cape, we are battling a bit with some of our areas, which we are working on currently. But in the Western Cape and places like Limpopo and the Free State, Mpumalanga, KZN, these provinces all have collection points where farmers can take their triple rinse empty containers and drop them off at a collection point. And what the person responsible for collection point do then, they check all the containers to make sure they are nominally empty or then triple rinsed. And they issue the farmer then with a certificate of adequate disposal, which we call the container disposal intel document, which the farmer can use then for his or her own certification. So many of our farmers are export farmers, or if they supply to one of the more advanced retail food outlets, and all those types of retailers and certification agencies demand that the farmers do partake in proper container management, and they've got to show proof of that. And the proof is then in the hands of the farmer in the form of that CODI Intel document. It says that I dispose of my containers lawfully at the CropLife SA certified recycler. So the system is working, and I am saying it cautiously, but in the year 2023, we managed to recover 86% of all the ATP containers from the farms and approximately 30 to 40% of all the other containers from the farm. So we are doing not too badly, but not that great either, because we want all the containers to come off the farm. So the farmers must really participate in the process, because like Giresh and Quaid mentioned to you, it's unlawful to burn them, it's unlawful to bury them, it's unlawful to dump them at the landfill site. It is about environmental safety, it's about the human safety. And the good thing about farmers partaking in the recycling of empty pesticide packaging is that it creates work for literally thousands and thousands of people out there that didn't have an income before. Now, we've been going at this for the past 15 years that I've been working on this in CropLife SA, and there are many, many people that make a good and a solid living out of collecting and recycling the empty containers that come off the farms. I'm proud to say that in the Western Cape, we're sitting over 90% of the farms are clean. In other words, there are no empty containers there, but we're working on the other farms. So farmers have an opportunity to get rid of the containers in a legal and a responsible way. All we ask them to do, triple rinse, puncture, contact one of our collectors, take it out there, and you might even be lucky in the area where there are some of the collectors who come out and they collect it from your farm. Must understand one thing, that we are not under the obligation as CropLife SA Africa or our recyclers to go and clean up a farm. That's a service which is offered by some people because they collect the containers and they make a business out of it. But we don't have any legal mandate or obligation to go to a farm and clean up the farm. That is the job of the farmer. The farmer is the waste generator. So the waste generator has a responsibility to dispose of the empty packaging in a responsible way. CropLife SA Africa has a product responsibility organization which is licensed and certified by the Department of Environmental Affairs, has a mandate to make sure that the farmers have a way of disposing it. And we have it in place. We've got the collection points in place. We've got the recyclers in place. And we would like to invite any farmer in the country, if you have a hiccup with empty containers, contact Hiresh or Quaid or myself. We will always bend over backwards to help a farmer to get rid of empty containers, because we do not want them to end up in the hands of farm workers, because I've seen the thing that happened to them. I've had a case in the Western Cape about 15 years ago where an entire farm worker family died within 4 hours after the cooking oil that was carried around in a container that contained organophosphate pesticide. And that is something that CropLife and the agricultural community do not want to happen. So that's why we go with such a strong appeal to the agricultural sector to say, let us all take hand. We have a system for you. You have the means to train your farm workers to rinse that container out at your spray tank, decant the spray water there, puncture it, put it in the store, make contact with one of the recyclers and get the farms cleaner. We're sitting now currently in the world as number 3, the third country in the world in terms of the third best in terms of recovering and recycling containers. That's not good enough for us. We want to be number 1. We want to outperform the Australians. We want to outperform the people in Brazil. And the only way to do it is all the farmers in South Africa take hands with CropLife SA and with our wide network of our sterling container management people and our certified recyclers to get all the empty containers off the farms and back into the circular economy. That's what our plea is to the agricultural sector.
It's great to hear that there's some positive strides being made when it comes to the use and the handling of pesticide chemicals in containers. But as you point out, Dr. Gerrit, the goal should be to get to that number 1 spot so that we don't have these issues of people dying and losing their lives as a result, I suppose, of improper use of these chemicals and containers. So we better understand what the National Environmental Management Waste Act of Environmental Affairs stipulate. We have an idea of why we should not be burning or burying pesticide containers and obsolete pesticides, as well as not dumping them as well. Dr. Gerrit, you've also taken us through what farmers can do with empty pesticide containers. But Hiresh, coming back to you, what must farmers do with old pesticides if they end up having that on their farm?
Farmers must firstly safeguard old pesticides by wrapping them securely in thick plastic bags that are marked hazardous waste. This is advice that me and Gerard, as well as Quaid, provide farmers with when they do call us regarding old pesticides or expired pesticides. And then thereafter, an inventory must be drafted. And this is a list of the old pesticides, where a template for such an inventory can be sourced from the CropLife SA website, www.croplife.co.za, under container management, which Gerard has just alluded to. We have a range of resources available to farmers under our container management tab on our website to assist and to guide them in terms of compliance with this act. Thereafter, once an inventory is made available, farmers must then make contact with one of the compliant hazardous waste management companies listed by CropLife SA for the disposal of the obsolete pesticides. So the highs and lows, obsolete pesticides cannot be buried or burned. They must be safeguarded, collected by a compliant hazmat service provider, and then thereafter incinerated. That's the way in terms of managing old pesticides by farmers.
That was, of course, Dr. Gerrit Verdoorn, Operations and Stewardship Manager at CropLife South Africa, alongside Compliance Specialist Quaid Singh Jam and Stewardship Specialist Hiresh Ramanand. You can, of course, read more on this topic by visiting www.foodformzansi.co.za. And that's a wrap. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss an episode. From me, Duncan Masiwa, our technical producer Megan van der Vent, and the rest of hashtag Team Food for Mzansi. Thanks for listening.
Life in South Africa can be a lot. I mean, scroll through Twitter for a minute and tell me I'm wrong. Thank God for South Africans though, right? We're inspiring, and even on the bad days, we fight back with a smile. That's why I love Food for Mzansi so much. They're not ashamed to celebrate the ordinary unsung heroes who work every day to put food on our nation's tables. Go to foodformzansi.co.za and never miss an inspiring story.